Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here today to sort of break down that stack of research and articles you sent over.
Yeah, try and make sense of it all.
Exactly. Take what feels like, dense academic stuff or confusing history and turn it into something clear, useful, and, well, hopefully fascinating.
Definitely.
And today, we're tackling probably the most personal and sometimes the most confusing topic there is, money. Specifically, why we handle it the way we do.
Mm-hmm. It gets emotional.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
So if you, like I think most people, have ever looked at a friend or a family member or even just read a news story about someone making what seems like a completely crazy financial move.
Uh-huh. Like blowing a whole paycheck on lottery tickets?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or maybe refusing to ever touch the stock market, even though the data looks good over decades.
Mm.
You just thought, are they nuts?
Right. What are they thinking?
Then this deep dive, it's really for you. Our mission today is to unpack the psychology behind those seemingly irrational decisions.
And the sources point to this really kind of radical idea, which we should put right out there.
Yeah, what is it?
It's that no one is crazy.
No one is crazy.
That's right. So our goal here is to basically dismantle this notion of a single universal financial reality.
Okay.
We're going to explore the boundaries of, let's say, financial sanity. And what we'll find is that those boundaries, they're entirely personal. They're not objective at all. The core concept, and this comes straight from the material you gathered, it defines this deep paradox that we really need to keep in mind throughout our conversation.
Okay, what's the paradox?
It's this. Your personal lived experiences with money, your specific tiny slice of history makeup, maybe, get this, 0.0000001% of everything that's ever happened financially in the world.
Wow. Okay, that's infinitesimally small.
Exactly. But, and here's the picker, that tiny, tiny slice. It accounts for maybe 80% of how you fundamentally see the world working, how you judge risk, how you save, your whole economic worldview.
80% based on almost nothing, globally speaking. That's staggering.
It is. So that's what we're going to spend our time on today, unpacking how this unique mix of your personal past, where you grew up, even just the timing of when you grew up,
Right.
how it creates these incredibly different mental models of the economy. And these models, frankly, they end up justifying almost any financial decision a person makes.
Okay, let's dig into that foundational idea then. No one is crazy.
Right.
When you really think about the sheer number of things that shape how one person sees money, this kind of makes sense that no two people would see it the same way, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The variables are just immense.
I mean, think about it. Different generations have totally different starting points.
Big time.
Your parents, their income level, their values about money, saving versus spending, that's huge. Where you live, not just the country, but like the specific region or city.
Local economies matter.
The job market you enter when you're young.
Totally different opportunities.
And then there's just sheer luck, right? Good or bad.
Oh, yeah. Can't discount luck.
All of that blends together to teach us these really different lessons about money, usually when we're young and, most impressionable.
And here's the key psychological bit, the thing that makes it stick so hard.
What's that?
It's that what you experience yourself, what you actually feel the consequences of, that's just way more powerful, way more emotionally baked in than anything you just read about or hear about secondhand.
Ah, okay. So lived experience trumps abstract knowledge.
Pretty much every time when it comes to these core beliefs. And what's really interesting is how these intense personal experiences, they create this kind of emotional anchor.
An anchor.
Yeah, like a deep-seated bias. And later on, even if you get rational information, objective data, that anchor often makes it really hard to change your mind.
So that's where cognitive dissonance comes in.
Exactly. That's the perfect term. It's when the hard facts, the historical data, clash head-on with a belief you hold really deeply because you lived something that felt different.
Okay.
And the classic example, certainly in the U.S., is the Great Depression.
Right. The generation that lived through that.
Frederick Lewis Allen wrote about this back then. He said the Depression marked millions of Americans inwardly for the rest of their lives.
Wow. Inwardly.
Yeah. These folks, even decades later, they looked at banks, credit, the stock market, everything through this permanent filter of potential collapse, extreme scarcity.
Their mental model was basically, it can all vanish overnight.
That was their reality, their lived reality.
And you have to really pause and think about that. That fear wasn't theoretical. It wasn't data points on a chart.
No, it was survival.
Yeah. Imagine losing everything,
Yeah.
maybe multiple times. And then years later, Some economist shows you a spreadsheet saying, oh, the risk of that happening again is actually pretty low.
Which message hits harder, the spreadsheet or the memory of potential starvation?
The memory, no question.
Precisely. And the sources give this amazing contrast that shows just how subjective even something like the Depression was. It's the anecdote about John F. Kennedy. When he was running for president in 1960, people asked him about his memories of the Depression.
And what did he say?
He was surprisingly honest, maybe even a bit naive politically. He said, I have no firsthand knowledge of the Depression.
Wow. Because his family was incredibly wealthy.
Exactly. He actually said that during the 30s, for his family, they had bigger houses, more servants, we traveled more.
So the complete opposite experience of most people.
Right. He said the only way he really experienced it was seeing his father hire extra groundskeepers and staff.
Oh, right.
Specifically, as he put it, just to give them a job so they could eat. His actual understanding of the nationwide catastrophe, he learned it from books at Harvard.
That's such a stark difference. For millions, it was soup lines, bank failures, genuine terror.
Uh-huh. The sound of the phone not ringing.
And for him, it was an academic subject in a library.
It really highlights the gap. And interestingly, that lack of personal economic scar tissue, as you might call it, it actually became a political problem for him in the 1960 election.
Really?
How? Well, some voters were skeptical. How could this guy, who'd never felt the pinch of economic fear, really be trusted to manage the economy for everyone else?
I can see that. His experience was just so different.
It was a liability, and arguably the only reason he overcame it was because he did share another huge emotional collective experience with the public.
Which was?
World War II. His service, the shared sense of struggle and risk in the war, that gave him a relatable history that his economic background didn't provide.
Okay. So one shared trauma could sort of substitute for the lack of another.
In a political sense, perhaps, it brings us back to this idea studying something versus living through the consequences.
Right. The limits of book learning.
We can all read history books. We can look at charts showing how often markets drop 30%. Intellectually, we know it happens.
Yeah, the data's there.
Yeah.
A 30% drop happens, what, every few years on average?
Right.
Something like that.
Something like that. But those spreadsheets, those history books, they just cannot replicate the feeling.
What feeling are you talking about?
The feeling of, say, coming home after a big market drop, looking at your kids, and having that cold knot of panic in your stomach, wondering, genuinely wondering, if a financial mistake you made is going to screw up their future, will they not be able to go to college because of this? That feeling, that's the real driver.
Not the percentage points on the screen.
No way. That feeling overwhelms the objective data.
Which perfectly sets up that quote from Michael Batnick you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it hits home, doesn't it? Some lessons have to be experienced before they can be understood.
Exactly. You can know about volatility, but until you've felt that gut-wrenching fear when your own money is on the line.
You don't really understand it, not in a way that truly shapes your deep-seated instincts.
So your personal history isn't just informing your choices.
It basically is your decision-making framework. It's the lens through which you see everything else.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense psychologically. But does the hard data actually back this up? This idea that our youthful experiences anchor us?
Oh, absolutely. This isn't just anecdote, it's measurable. Which brings us to that really important 2006 study.
The NBER one, by Melmandier and Nagel.
That's the one. It's kind of a cornerstone in behavioral finance because it connects that psychology we've been talking about to actual large-scale economic behavior.
So what did they do?
They went through, 50 years of data from the Survey of Consumer Finances, a huge data set looking at what real Americans did with their money over time.
And what were they looking for?
Well, traditional economic theory, like the efficient market hypothesis, would suggest that as people get older, get more educated, they should adjust their investment strategies based on current facts, their stage of life, objective risk analysis.
Right, you learn more, you adapt. Seems logical.
Yeah, but that's not what they found. Not really.
Oh. So what did they find?
They found that people's investment decisions throughout their entire lives were consistently and powerfully anchored to the economic conditions they experienced when they were young.
Specifically young.
Yeah, especially their teens and early 20s, that formative period. The economic climate back then had this incredibly strong gravitational pull on their choices decades later.
Stronger than, say, getting a finance degree later in life.
That's the really striking part. They found this anchoring effect systematically outweighed things like their intelligence, their level of education, even their financial sophistication gained later on.
Hold on, let me push back on that a bit. You're saying if someone goes to, like, a top business school, gets an MBA, that intense financial training has less impact on their actual risk-taking than, say, the inflation rate when they were 18.
It sounds counterintuitive, I know.
It sounds like a huge knock against rational education.
I see it less as a knock on education and more as just a really profound insight into how we're wired, how conditioning works. Malmandir and Nagel aren't saying education doesn't help at all. It does. It gives you tools, frameworks. But it often doesn't erase the deep emotional imprint of those early experiences.
So the person who lived through a market crash as a young adult.
They might intellectually know about diversification and long-term averages, but when the next crash happens, their gut reaction, their feeling, is still shaped by that original trauma. It just feels like an existential threat in a way it might not to someone else.
The trauma speaks lighter than the textbook.
Often, yes, especially in moments of stress.
So what specific anchors did they find in the data? What kind of youthful experiences really stuck with people?
Two big ones stood out really clearly in their analysis.
Okay.
First, inflation. People who grew up when inflation was high and volatile, think the late 60s, the 70s, early 80s.
Right. Gas lines, prices jumping up.
Those individuals consistently invested less of their money in bonds and other fixed income assets later in life, even when inflation was low, decades later.
Why? What was the connection?
They seem to have this deep-seated association. Bonds equal loss of purchasing power. They just viewed them as inherently riskier, regardless of the current economic climate. The memory of inflation-killing bond returns stuck with them.
Okay, that makes sense. What was the second big anchor?
The stock market itself, and this one might be even more powerful.
How so?
If you grew up, especially during your teens and 20s, when the stock market was delivering strong, consistent gains, like a major bull market,
Yeah.
you invested significantly more of your money in stocks throughout the rest of your life.
So you came to believe deep down that stocks just go up over time.
Essentially, yes. You developed an ingrained belief that stocks are the main engine for building wealth. Market dips feel more like temporary setbacks or buying opportunities rather than signs of impending doom.
Your fundamental optimism about equities was set early on.
Exactly. Your baseline expectation was positive.
Wow. This really drives home how much of your financial outlook might just boil down to the pure random chance of your birth year.
It's a bit terrifying when you think about it that way, isn't it? How much is potentially determined before you even make your first informed decision.
Yeah. Let's make that contrast really stark for people listening. Imagine two investors.
Okay.
Person A is born in, say, 1970.
Okay, born in 1970. So they're hitting their teens and 20s in the 80s and 90s.
Right. Just as arguably the biggest, longest bull market in history is taking off.
The Great Moderation period.
Yeah. For them, during those crucial formative years, the S&P 500, adjusted for inflation, went up something like 10 times.
A tenfold increase. Incredible.
So for that person, stocks probably feel almost magical. Their lived experiences, markets go up, dips are short-lived, investing pays off handsomely. Their baseline is optimistic.
Makes sense. Their formative experience was overwhelmingly positive.
Now, person B, born just 20 years earlier, in 1950.
Okay, 1950. So their teens and 20s are the 1960s and 1970s.
A very different era. During their key formative years, the stock market, again adjusted for inflation and including dividends, basically went nowhere, flat.
Sideways for almost 2 decades in real terms. Yeah.
So what's their ingrained lesson? Probably that the stock market is risky, maybe even pointless. A casino, definitely not a reliable way to build wealth.
They likely carry a deep skepticism, a caution that the 1970 person just doesn't have baked in.
Exactly. So how can you possibly expect these two people, whose views were forged by such radically different market environments purely due to their birth date,
to ever truly agree on things like risk tolerance, the right asset allocation, or how patient you need to be?
You can't. The 1970 baby instinctively wants to buy the dip. The 1950 baby instinctively wants to run for the hills.
Their common sense about markets is just fundamentally different.
And you see the same pattern play out in the bond market conversation we touched on earlier.
With Bill Gross.
Yeah, Bill Gross. Became this legendary bond fund manager, right? The bond king. His huge success, his entire high-profile career, almost perfectly maps onto that period starting in the early 1980s when interest rates began that long generational decline.
Right. Falling rates mean rising bond prices. That was a massive tailwind for decades.
So in his lived experience, managing bonds during that specific window.
Bonds were amazing. They were these steady, reliable, wealth-generating machines. He built a legendary reputation riding that wave.
But now think about his father's generation, or anyone who was trying to rely on bonds back in the high inflation 70s.
Yeah, when inflation was often higher than the interest rate the bond paid you.
Exactly. For them, bonds weren't generating wealth. They felt like wealth incinerators. You were losing purchasing power every year.
So one generation sees bonds as safe havens and wealth builders. The next sees them as guaranteed losers in real terms. Same asset, totally different perception based purely on the timing of their experience.
The inflation difference alone is it's huge. Someone born in the 1960s in the U.S., they lived through prices more than tripling during their childhood and young adulthood.
They remember the gas lines, the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. Maybe they saw their parents' savings get eaten away.
So they carry this inherent fear of inflation, maybe a distrust of holding cash.
Makes sense. But now take someone born in, say, 1990.
Yeah.
Their entire adult life, inflation has been mostly low and stable, generally around the Fed's 2% target.
Right. It's barely been a factor for most of their financial lives.
So for them, high inflation is more like a historical concept or something that happens in other countries.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like a tangible personal threat in the same way.
These two people could read the exact same inflation report from the Fed tomorrow morning.
And have completely different emotional reactions and draw totally different conclusions about what they should do with their money. They're living in different economic universes based on their lived history.
And it's crucial to remember, these differences aren't just between generations or even just across the whole country. They get incredibly specific, down to the local level, down to demographics.
Oh, absolutely. The economy isn't one monolithic thing. It's experienced very differently depending on who you are and where you are.
Let's take the Great Recession as an example. November 2009. The headline national unemployment rate in the U.S. was about 10%.
Which is terrible,
Yeah.
obviously. A really bad number.
But that 10% completely hides the vastly different realities underneath.
Right. It's just an average.
So the sources point out, for African-American men aged 16 to 19 who didn't have a high school diploma,
Yeah. What was their rate?
their unemployment rate was 49%.
Wow. Almost 1 in 2.
Basically, half of the young men in that specific group couldn't find work.
Devastating.
Just devastating. Now contrast that.
Okay. Contrast that with, say, Caucasian woman over 45 who had a college degree.
Okay, their unemployment rate,
It was 4%.
4%. That's practically full employment by most economic standards.
Exactly. So in the same country, at the same moment in time, you have one group experiencing near total joblessness, scarcity, intense competition for anything.
And another group experiencing a relatively healthy, stable job market where opportunities probably still felt reasonably available. How can those two groups possibly develop the same attitudes about economic fairness, the value of saving versus spending, the risk of quitting a job, the trustworthiness of the system?
They can't. Their lived realities are just too far apart. Their calculation of risk and opportunity is fundamentally different because the landscape they navigate every day is different.
And if we zoom out even further, look globally. The extremes become even more pronounced.
Right. Think about something like faith in the markets themselves.
Yeah, during World War II, between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. stock market didn't just survive. It more than doubled.
Right. The U.S. economy actually boomed during the war years, becoming incredibly strong.
But what was happening in Germany or Japan during that same period?
Total devastation. Their local stock markets, their entire financial systems were essentially wiped out.
Yeah.
Industries destroyed, currency collapsed.
The sources mentioned that near the end of the war, German farms were producing so little food that people were getting maybe 1,000 calories a day.
Survival was the only goal. Forget investment returns.
So, should we reasonably expect someone whose formative experience was the U.S. wartime boom to have the same deep-seated belief in market resilience or the stability of capitalism?
As someone whose entire world, financial and physical, was reduced to rubble and had to be rebuilt from scratch?
Absolutely not. Their fundamental mental models of how the world works, how fragile things are, have to be incomparable.
They really do. And when we start to truly absorb just how incredibly varied these financial realities are across time, across places, across different groups of people,
Yeah.
that's when we can start to develop maybe a little more empathy. We can begin to understand decisions that, from our own viewpoint, might seem completely outrageous or even self-destructive.
Okay, so understanding the diversity of experience helps explain the crazy decisions.
Exactly. Let's take that Foxconn example from the research.
Right, the big electronics manufacturer in China.
Oh,
The New York Times story about the working conditions.
yeah, detailing the really long hours, the low pay, the tough environment, and understandably, American readers saw that and were horrified.
Looked like clear exploitation, which, by Western labor standards, it certainly was.
It fit a narrative of exploitation. But then something really interesting happened that complicated that narrative.
What was that?
A comment showed up online. It was from someone claiming to be the nephew of a woman who actually worked in that Foxconn factory.
Okay, and what did he say?
He said that his aunt didn't see working in the sweatshop, as the article called it, as exploitation. She actually viewed it as a significant improvement in her life.
An improvement? How could that be?
This is where the context becomes absolutely crucial and pretty gut-wrenching, frankly.
Okay.
He explained that before she got the factory job, her only way to survive in her very poor rural area was sex work, prostitution.
Oh, wow.
And the nephew wrote something like, she would rather be exploited by a capitalist boss for a few dollars than have her body exploited by multiple men for pennies.
That completely reframes the situation, doesn't it?
It totally shifts the calculus. What looks like horrific exploitation from one perspective, our perspective, with far more options and safety nets, was seen by her as a step up. A move towards more structure, maybe more safety, certainly a different kind of work, even if it was incredibly hard.
It forces you to ask, what choice would you make if those were your only two options?
Exactly. The factory job, however bad by our standards, represented an opportunity and a level of agency she didn't have before. It shows how what seems like a simple black and white moral issue from one side
is actually a complex choice based on opportunity or lack thereof from the other side. Their lived reality, their available options were just fundamentally different. Their rational choice was based on a completely different set of starting conditions.
Precisely. And we see a similar dynamic, maybe less extreme but still powerful, with the lottery ticket paradox right here in the U.S.
Yes, the lottery. The statistics are just baffling when you look at them rationally.
They really are. Americans spend more money on lottery tickets than they spend on movies, video games, music, sporting events, and books combined.
Combined, that's unbelievable. It's a staggering amount of money going into something with such terrible odds.
Objectively, it's a terrible investment, and the data clearly shows who is spending the most.
It's mostly lower-income individuals, right?
By a long shot.
Yeah.
The lowest-income households in the U.S. spend, on average, around $412 a year on lottery tickets.
$412.
And that's about 4 times the amount spent by people in the highest income groups.
Okay, and here's the real kicker, the part that seems so irrational.
The $400 emergency.
Exactly. The stat that something like 40% of Americans can't come up with $400 cash for an emergency.
Yeah.
So you have this situation where the very people who often lack that basic safety net are the same ones spending that exact amount or more on lottery tickets over the course of a year.
From a purely financial planning perspective, it looks like self-sabotage. You're blowing your emergency fund on 1,000,000 to 1 odds.
So, if the spreadsheet logic says it's crazy, we have to ask, like with the Foxconn example.
Yeah.
What's the internal logic? What's the narrative that makes this feel like the right choice?
And it comes back to that idea of perceived opportunity, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
For many low-income lottery players, their lived experience tells them that the traditional paths to getting ahead financially just aren't realistically open to them.
Like what? Like saving small amounts?
Yeah, trying to save $400, $500 a year, it feels almost pointless when one unexpected car repair or medical bill can wipe it out instantly, or when inflation eats away at it.
Or getting a big raise or promotion might seem impossible due to lack of education or lack of opportunities in their area or systemic barriers.
Right. So the sensible advice, save diligently, climb the ladder, it just doesn't resonate with their reality. It feels out of reach.
They don't see a realistic path to affording the good stuff, a nicer home, vacations, sending kids to college without debt, things that higher earners might see as achievable with time and effort.
Exactly. So what does the lottery ticket offer?
It offers a dream, right?
It's the only time, perhaps, they feel they can hold a tangible possibility, however remote, of getting those things. They aren't buying a statistically sound investment.
They're buying hope.
They're buying, as the source material called it, a dream payment. They're paying for that moment of possibility, that fleeting fantasy of escaping their current economic constraints.
Even if they know the odds are terrible.
The feeling of hope, even for a moment, might be worth the $5 or $10 to them, given their perceived lack of other paths to that feeling. You might disagree with the choice, but you can understand the emotional logic behind it.
Okay. That really brings it all together. Almost nobody makes financial decisions using just a spreadsheet.
Very few. We make them based on our lived stories. At the kitchen table, maybe late at night worrying about bills.
Yeah, driven by our personal history, our fears, our pride, what we think is possible for us, and yeah, the marketing that targets those hopes and fears.
So every decision, whether we label it smart or crazy, actually makes sense to the person making it in that moment. It fits their narrative.
It aligns with their unique, history-shaped map of the world.
Exactly. Which leads us nicely into the second big reason the sources give for why we see so much, let's call it, financial misbehavior.
Okay, what's the second reason?
It's the fact that the entire modern financial system we rely on, it's incredibly new. It's practically an infant.
Ah, okay. So it's not just that our personal histories are messy, it's that the tools we're supposed to use are also kind of untested.
Exactly. We're all basically financial newbies playing a game whose rules were written very, very recently.
I mean, money itself is ancient, right? Coins have been around for millennia.
Oh, yeah. King Alyattes in Lydia, first official currency around 600 BC. Money is old. But the systems and concepts we rely on today for things like long-term saving, retirement, paying for college,
Those are new.
in the grand scheme of things, extremely new, mere babies on the historical timeline.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's take the biggest one, retirement. The whole idea of retirement as we think of it now.
You mean like a dedicated period of leisure after you stop working?
Yeah.
Funded by savings.
Exactly that concept, that expectation that you'll have maybe decades of life after work. That's really only about 2 generations old, tops.
Really? What did people do before?
For most of history, and even in the U.S. until around World War II, most people just worked until they couldn't anymore, or until they died.
Wow.
We have the data. The labor force participation rate for men over 65, it was over 50% consistently until the 1940s.
So more than half of older men were still working.
Yep. This whole neat 3-stage life plan,
I took that.
education, then work, then retirement, that's largely a post-war invention, built on assumptions of economic growth and new social safety nets.
Like Social Security. That started it, didn't it?
It was the beginning, yeah. But Social Security, when it started, was designed purely as a basic safety net. It was never meant to fully replace your working income.
Right, it was supplemental.
Totally. Ida Mae Fuller, the very first person to get a Social Security check back in 1940, it was for $22.54.
$22, wow. Even adjusted for inflation, that's not much.
No, maybe around $400 in today's money. And it wasn't really until the 1980s that the average monthly Social Security check for a retiree consistently got over $1,000, adjusted for inflation.
So for its first 40 years, it was helpful, but not enough to live on comfortably for most people.
Definitely not. And there's this myth that persists
Nah.
that, well, okay, maybe Social Security wasn't enough, but back then, everyone had a great company pension, a defined benefit plan that took care of them.
Yeah, you hear that sometimes. The good old days of pensions.
But the data just doesn't support that being widespread. Research from the Employee Benefit Research Institute showed that even as late as 1975,
Yeah.
only about a quarter of Americans aged 65 or older actually received any income from a private pension.
Only a quarter.
Yep. And even for that minority who did get a pension, it typically only made up about 15% of their total household income.
So the idea of a guaranteed, comfortable pension-funded retirement being the norm,
Yeah.
it's just not accurate for most people historically.
Not really. The big shift, the move towards expecting individuals to fund their own retirement, that happened much more recently, mostly accelerating in the 1980s,
When we moved from defined benefit pensions
where the company promised you a certain payout and bore the risk.
to defined contribution plans,
Mhm.
like 401k.
Exactly. Where you contribute, you make the investment choices, and you bear all the risk. The responsibility completely shifted to the individual.
And this is where the newness of the tools becomes really critical.
Absolutely critical. We've basically put the entire weight of long-term financial security for millions of people onto financial vehicles that have almost no long-term track record themselves.
Okay, this is where it gets kind of mind-blowing.
Uh,
The 401k plan, the absolute bedrock of retirement saving for so many Americans now.
yeah. When was it invented?
It didn't even exist until 1978.
1978. That's wow.
So anyone born before, say, 1970, they grew up under a completely different set of assumptions about retirement. They had to learn this brand new self-directed system midstream.
And think about the Roth IRA, another cornerstone of modern retirement advice, especially for tax diversification.
Yeah. When did that come along?
1998.
1998. That's incredibly recent.
If the Roth IRA was a person, it would just barely be old enough to buy a drink in the U.S.
Yet we have this societal expectation that everyone should be an expert navigator of 401ks and Roth IRAs and asset allocation.
Using tools that are younger than many of the people expected to master them.
It really shouldn't be a surprise that people struggle with this stuff, that we're collectively kind of bad at saving and investing for the long term.
We're all learning on the fly. We're trying to pilot this complex aircraft, our financial future, while the instruction manual is still being written. And the plane itself was only designed a few decades ago.
That's a great analogy. And it applies just as much to other huge financial challenges, right? Like college debt.
Oh, absolutely. The student loan crisis is another perfect example of a problem born from rapid, recent change. Well, the sources highlight just how quickly college went from being a relative rarity to a perceived necessity.
Right. The percentage of adults with a bachelor's degree skyrocketed.
Yeah, it went from less than 1 in 20 Americans over 25 having a degree in 1940
Wow.
to about 1 in 4 by 2015. A massive shift in expectations. College became the expected pathway to the middle class for millions.
But at the exact same time.
The cost exploded. Average college tuition, adjusted for inflation, went up more than 4 times during that same period.
So it became way more necessary and way more expensive, all very quickly.
Exactly. That rapid simultaneous shift explains so much about why we see people making seemingly poor decisions about student loans over the last couple of decades.
There's no playbook for this. No generational wisdom passed down about how to handle the prospect of $100,000 in debt for a degree whose payoff wasn't guaranteed.
None. People weren't making bad choices because they were dumb. They were making choices in a brand new high-stakes environment with no map and no historical precedent to guide them. Society handed them this massive new financial burden with virtually no instruction manual.
And this newness extends to investment tools too, right? Even the simple ones.
Totally. Index funds often hailed now as the default, simple, passive way to invest.
Yeah.
They're less than 50 years old, still relatively new in the grand scheme.
Hedge funds? All the complex alternative investments?
Really only became mainstream players in the last 25 years or so.
Even just basic consumer debt, like mortgages, credit cards, car loans being commonplace.
That widespread use really took off after World War II, significantly boosted by things like the GI Bill, making borrowing easier and more acceptable for millions. Before that, large-scale consumer borrowing wasn't nearly as prevalent.
So almost every pillar of modern personal finance, retirement saving, education funding, investing tools, consumer credit, is remarkably young.
Extremely young. Which brings us to that final analogy from the source material, which I think sums it up perfectly.
The one about dogs.
Yeah. Dogs were domesticated, what, maybe 10,000 years ago?
Roughly, yeah.
And even after all that time, they still have some of those ingrained wild behaviors, right? Barking at the mailman, hoarding treats, freaking out during thunderstorms.
Sure. Instincts die hard.
Exactly. Now think about us. We, as participants in this incredibly complex modern financial world, with its 401ks and student debt and index funds, we have maybe 20 to 50 years of collective experience with these specific tools and systems.
We're basically financial toddlers compared to the dog's 10,000 years of domestication.
Pretty much. So it makes sense that we're still operating largely on gut instinct, on fear, on these deeply ingrained personal experiences we talked about earlier.
Rather than on some kind of seasoned, historically validated understanding of how these brand new systems actually work best over the long haul.
We haven't had time to evolve those reliable financial instincts yet.
Okay, so putting it all together.
Yeah.
We have these two huge forces at play. First, our financial decisions are deeply emotionally anchored to our own very specific, very limited personal experiences.
Right. That tiny slice dictating 80% of our worldview.
And second, the whole system we're trying to navigate, the tools, the expectations, the rules, is incredibly young and still changing rapidly.
Still basically in diapers, yeah.
When you combine those two things, the conclusion seems pretty clear.
Which is?
We all do things with money that might look crazy from the outside. Because we're emotional beings shaped by unique histories, trying our best to make sense of a financial world that's still figuring itself out.
That's a perfect summary. The real takeaway isn't just to judge what people do with their money, but to try and understand the why. Why does their personal story, their narrative, make that decision seem logical or even necessary to them?
Every choice makes sense to the person in the moment, given their map of the world.
It's a logic driven by experience and emotion, not just numbers on a page.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what does this mean for you, listening to this? As you go forward, maybe you talk to a financial advisor or you read some financial history.
Yeah.
What's the implication?
It's a really important question.
If we accept that these decisions are so heavily influenced by personal history, by fear, by luck, things a spreadsheet just can't capture, then how much weight should you actually give to historical data? Or to advice from an expert whose lived experience might be totally different from yours?
Right. If your advisor is, say, 55 years old and got started during a huge bull market and never really experienced devastating inflation firsthand.
And you're 30,
Yeah.
and you entered the job market during the 2008 crash and are staring down massive student loans.
You're operating from fundamentally different starting points. You live in different economic realities, in a way.
So how much is advice based on the last 50 years worth when the actual tools and challenges, the 401k, the student debt burden, the gig economy, are constantly changing the game right now?
How much does historical data apply when the system itself is evolving so fast?
That's the question we want to leave you with, something to think about. Where does that objective advice end, and where does your own personal history-bound context need to take over?
A crucial balance to find.
Definitely something to mull over. Thanks for diving